On the night of February 11th, 1877, Louisa Brent saddled her father's horse in the dark, in the rain, and rode north off a Taos Valley homestead, with no plan except that she would not be at that homestead in the morning when the wedding was scheduled to begin. She was 19 years old. The man she was to marry was 60, with 3 previous wives in the ground on his spread. And her father had arranged it to settle a land debt of 40 acres. Louisa had known this was coming for 6 months. She had decided, sometime in the preceding week, that 40 acres was not a price she was prepared to pay. The mountain trail north of Taos in a February rainstorm is no place for a person with no plan. But by midnight, when she had lost the trail entirely in the trees, she could see a light through the branches. A single amber square, steady in the dark. What she did not know was that the man in that cabin had opened his door before in a mountain emergency, and that he had a way of asking only the questions that mattered. The first 2 were, "Are you hurt?" and "Are you hungry?" She could see a light through the trees. She didn't know who was in there. She rode toward it anyway. But to understand why Louisa Brent decided that a February mountain rainstorm was preferable to the morning, we have to go back to the day her father explained what she was worth in acres. Louisa's mother had died 3 years earlier, of the kind of lung ailment that the New Mexico high country could bring on, and not always let go of. Her name had been Marie, and she had been a practical woman with a deep tenderness that she expressed through cooking, and through the specific way she listened when Louisa talked, fully, without looking away, as if what Louisa said was the most interesting thing in the room. She had not looked away. And then she had died, and the person who had listened that way was gone. And the house had been quieter ever since in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Duncan Brent had managed the absence by working harder. That was his way with difficulty. He simply pressed himself against more of it, as if the additional weight of work would crowd out the additional weight of loss. He was not a bad man. He was a man who did not know what to do with grief, except to bury it in effort, and who had, over 3 years, buried himself so thoroughly in the effort that he had lost track of what the effort was originally for. The land debt to Elias Cord was the result of 2 poor seasons in a row, and a loan he had needed, and a rate that had seemed manageable at the time, and was not. The arrangement he made to settle it was the arrangement of a man who had stopped seeing his daughter as a person, and had begun to see her as a resource to be allocated. He had not done this cruelly. He had done it with the specific blindness of a man who had been looking at ledgers for 2 years and had forgotten how to look at people. Louisa had watched this happen. She had watched the ledgers become more important than the meals, and the meals become something she made so that the ledgers could be worked on uninterrupted. She had watched the 3 years of her mother's absence reshape her father into someone who did not mean to be cruel and was being it anyway, by degrees, in the specific way that a man who is not paying attention can be cruel without knowing. She had said nothing about Elias Cord for 6 months. She had calculated, with the careful arithmetic of a young woman who has learned that speaking too soon loses the argument, that she needed to wait until she understood the situation fully. She had understood the situation fully in January, when she overheard her father telling Cord that she was a capable girl, not a beauty, but capable, said as if she were a tool whose qualities were being represented accurately to a buyer. She had gone to her room and packed a bag, not all at once, that would have been noticed, a little at a time, over 2 weeks, so that the things she was taking out of the house were not missed. On February 11th, the night before the wedding, she waited until the house was completely dark, and then she went to the barn and saddled the roan horse, her father's good horse, not the work animal, and tied her bag to the saddle and rode north. She had been in the Sangre de Cristo foothills once, on a summer ride with her mother when she was 12. She remembered that they were cold even in summer, and that they were very large. She remembered that her mother had looked at them and said, "Those are the mountains that decide things. Not the people, the mountains." She had thought about that in the years since, without knowing exactly what her mother had meant. She thought she understood it now. She rode north into the mountains on a February night in the rain, because the mountains were where the decision was. Not in Taos, not in the homestead, not in the preacher's words at 9 in the morning. In the mountains, in the dark, in the rain, with a choice she had made before she was ready and had to make anyway. She rode for 2 hours. She lost the trail. She found the light. Cal Rader opened the door. He was 37 years old, and he had lived in the Sangre de Cristos for 9 years since his army service ended, and he had seen mountain emergencies before. He knew what a person looked like when they had been riding in the rain for 2 hours, and had made a desperate choice, and had not yet had time to understand the full dimensions of what they had done. He asked if she was hurt. She said no. He asked if she was hungry. She said yes. He said, "Come in." He put her horse in the lean-to and made coffee, and did not ask any of the other questions. Not that night. She sat at his table in her wet coat and drank coffee, and ate the cornbread he put in front of her, and looked at the cabin door. He had bolted it when he came back from the lean-to. She watched him do it. He drew the bolt from the inside, a solid bolt, well made, sitting in its bracket with the easy certainty of a thing that has been in its place a long time. The bolt was on the inside. She could open it if she chose. She could walk out that door any time she decided to walk out. The bolt was hers to draw or lift. She had not been somewhere with an inside bolt in 6 months. She looked at the bolt for a long time. She put her hands flat on the table and felt the warmth of the coffee going through her, and thought, "I did not know that was what I needed." She thought, "A door that locks from the inside." She thought, "That is the whole of it." She fell asleep in the chair by the fire some time before dawn. She did not dream. The first morning was quiet. She woke to Cal making breakfast, not elaborate, just the practical food of a man who feeds himself efficiently, and the mountain light coming through the east window, which was a gray-blue light unlike any light she had known in the valley. He had not asked her anything yet. He made breakfast and she ate it, and he drank his coffee and looked at the window, and the silence was the specific silence of a person who is not pressing. She thought, "He is not going to ask unless I offer." She thought, "I can offer when I am ready." She waited until after breakfast. Then she said, "My father arranged a marriage for me. The man is 60 years old. He has had 3 wives. They died on his property." She said it plainly, the facts of it, without the specific inflections of apology or pleading. "I left last night." Cal said, "Are you going back?" She said no. He said, "Then don't." He said it the way a man says a practical thing, not with drama. Not with a great weighing of implications, just, "The situation is clear and here is the response the situation calls for." She had been braced for an argument about her father's rights, or the law, or the obligation of daughters, or the complicated social arithmetic of her position. She had not been braced for, "Then don't." She said, "My father will look for me." He said, "Probably." She said, "He may come up here." He said, "He might." She said, "I don't want to cause trouble for you." He said, "You haven't yet." She thought about that for a moment. She thought, "He has not weighed the cost of keeping me against the cost of turning me out. He has simply said, 'Then don't go back.' And you haven't caused trouble yet." She thought, that is what it looks like when someone decides a thing and acts on it without elaborate justification. She thought, I would like to be in the presence of that for a while. She stayed. On the second day, she found a small knife on the table. It was in its sheath, small and practical, the kind of thing you used for utility work. Cal had left it on the table the way he left everything he put in places, matter-of-factly, without announcement. It was simply there, the way the coffee was simply there in the morning. She looked at it. She picked it up. She put it in her coat pocket. She did not thank him for it. She did not think he wanted to be thanked. The knife was practical, like everything else here, and it was there because she might need it, and now she had it. She thought, this is what being looked after looks like when the person looking after you is practical rather than elaborate. She thought, I prefer this kind. She carried the knife for the rest of her time at the cabin. It was small enough to forget about until she needed to remember it. On the third day, Tom's Ortega arrived. He came on a mule with supplies and the easy, unhurried manner of a man who had made this trip many times and saw no reason to rush. He was 60 years old, a Taos muleteer who had known Cal for 6 years and communicated almost entirely in practical observations and the occasional dry joke. He set the supplies inside, and then he said to Louisa, in a low voice while Cal was unloading the mule, "Your father came to town this morning, asking which way you went." She said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him the tracks went south toward Santa Fe." He paused. They did not. She looked at him. He winked. Just once. The wink of a man who has decided a thing and does not need to make more of it. He remounted his mule and said something to Cal in the low, rapid Spanish they used between them, and Cal laughed, the first time she had heard him laugh, a short sound, surprised out of him, and Tom's rode back down the mountain. Louisa stood in the cabin doorway and watched him go and thought, he lied to my father without being asked. She thought, he decided that on his own. He did not come up the mountain to consult with Cal about it. He came with supplies and with a piece of information and a decision already made. She thought, this is what community looks like. Not the community that shows up to tell you your duty. The other kind. She thought, Cal has the other kind. She thought, I would like to be in the other kind for a while. She was. The second week at the cabin was different from the first. In the first week, Louisa had been mostly silent. She had helped with the cabin tasks. Water, wood, the morning and evening fire. Because she could not be still, and because she needed to be useful, but she had not talked much. She had been processing the fact of what she had done. In the second week, she started to talk. Not about the wedding, or her father, or Cord. She talked about the mountain, which was the most extraordinary thing she had ever been inside. She had opinions about the mountain. She had opinions about the way the pine shadows moved in the afternoon, and the specific blue of the morning sky at this elevation, and the particular quality of the silence after snowfall. She had opinions about Cal's tools, 2 of which were inefficient, and 1 of which was poorly designed. Cal listened to all of it. He responded to the tool opinions with the specific engagement of a man who is interested in whether his tools are right and has not thought about the question from this angle before. He agreed about one tool and disagreed about another and explained why, and she listened to the explanation and thought, he is taking the opinions seriously. She thought, I have not had my opinions taken seriously in some time. She thought, I have opinions about a great many things that have not been taken seriously in some time. She felt something shift in her. Something that had been held very carefully for 3 years began to loosen. She said more things. She found that the more she said, the more there was. that there was a person inside her who had a great deal to say and had been saying it to herself for years and was glad, finally, to have somewhere to put it. Cal said, "One evening you should have been talking all along." She said, "There wasn't anyone to talk to." He said, "You're good at it." She said, "I know. I didn't know until now." He said, "Why not?" She said, "I didn't know what it sounded like." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I know." He drank his coffee and looked at the fire. He said, "Keep doing it." She did. In the week before her father came up the mountain, Louisa practiced being the person she was being. She helped with the horses and the traps and the morning census of what needed doing, which Cal did every day with the methodical efficiency of a man who lives alone in the mountains and cannot afford to miss something. She learned to read the weather the way he read it, the cloud formations and the wind direction and the smell of the air before snow, because he taught her when she asked, and she asked because she genuinely wanted to know. She learned to throw the small knife at a pine tree target in the afternoons. She was not good at it yet. Cal watched from the lean-to doorway one afternoon and said only, "Wrist." She adjusted her wrist. The next throw was better. Neither of them acknowledged that this was not a normal domestic activity. She thought, what would have been normal in the other life? She thought about Elias Cord's house, where 3 women had preceded her, and where she would have learned whatever the household required of her. She thought, this is not normal, and it is right. She thought, normal was not going to be right. She was glad she had ridden north. On the 6th day her father came up the mountain. She saw them from the window. 2 riders, Duncan Brandt and a hired man from Cord Spread, picking their way up the trail below the cabin clearing. She had been watching for this without meaning to, the way you watch for the thing you know is coming. She went to the door. She did not call for Cal. She put her coat on and put the knife in her pocket and went to stand in the clearing. Her father reached the clearing and stopped his horse. He looked at her. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the hired man beside him. He said, "Louisa." She said, "Father." He said, "You will come home with us." She said, "No." The clarity of it surprised her. She had been thinking in the preceding days about what she would say to him, running through arguments and positions and counter-arguments. But when it came to the moment, she didn't need any of them. The answer was just, no. He said, "You have obligations." She said, "I have the obligation to myself that I was not meeting. I am meeting it now." He said, "The debt." She said, "The debt is between you and Cord. I did not make it. I am not its payment." He said, "You don't understand the." She said, "I understand it. I've understood it for 6 months. I watched you make it. You have another way to settle it. You have not tried that way because this way seemed easier. It is not easier. I am not going back." She felt Cal come out of the cabin behind her. He did not speak. He did not move past her. He simply stood there, behind her, present. Her father looked at Cal. He said, "Who are you?" Cal said, "Cal Rader. This is my land." Duncan looked at him for a moment. He said, "She can't stay here." Cal said, "She's staying here." Duncan said, "There are laws." Cal said, "There are no laws that compel a woman to marry a man she doesn't choose. I'd encourage you to speak to a lawyer before you invoke the law on this mountain." The hired man had been looking at Cal since he came out of the cabin. He had made a private assessment. He was already turning his horse. Duncan looked at Louisa one more time. He said, "You've ruined us." She said, "No. You spent what wasn't yours and I am not the payment." He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. She had been looking away for 3 years, away from the ledgers and the arrangements and the gradual reduction of herself to a line item. She was done looking away. He rode down the mountain. The hired man had already gone. Cal stood behind her for a moment after they were out of sight. Then he said, "That was the right sentence." She said, "I know. I've been working up to it." She put the knife back in her coat pocket. She turned and went back to the cabin and drew the bolt on the door, not because she was hiding, but because the cabin was warm and the mountain was cold and she was home. In March, Toms returned with the news that Duncan Brandt had renegotiated the land debt with Cord directly, which had always been possible and had never been attempted until it became necessary. Louisa received this news at the cabin table with the specific calm of a person who has known all along that another way existed. She said, "He found another way." Cal said, "Yes." She said, "He always could have." Cal said, "Yes." She said, "He needed to be left without the other option." Cal said, "That's what it looks like." She thought about her father and the ledgers and the 3 years of watching. She thought, he was not a bad man. He was a man who chose the easiest solution until the easiest solution was no longer available. She thought, I was not going to be the easiest solution. She thought, I am glad I was not. She and Cal married in Taos in June 1877. Tom's is witness, the mountain air warm in the summer. The Sangre de Cristo cabin had 2 names on the supply list at the Taos store from that summer forward, Cal Rader and Louisa Rader. She had put her name beside his with the specific, deliberate pleasure of a person writing something they have been working toward. In the evenings, with the mountain going gold outside the window, she drew the cabin bolt from the inside. Not to hide, not to keep anyone out, just because the cabin was hers, and the day was done and she was in it. The door locked from the inside. She had the key. She always had. She had just needed the cabin. There are women who ride north in the rain, with no plan except not there. And then there are the mornings after, and the light in the window, and the question, are you hurt? And are you hungry? And the specific answer to that question that everything else follows from. Louisa Brandt had answered the question, and everything had followed from it, exactly as it was supposed to. If something in this story found you today, Louisa's particular ride into the dark, or Cal's particular door, stay with us. There are more stories here, and every one of them is about a bolt on the inside of a door. The cabin on the mountain had been Cal's for 9 years, and it had the specific character of a thing that has been lived in alone, orderly, sufficient. Nothing more than what was needed. He had built most of the furniture himself, which was visible in the way the table was exactly the right height for a man who stood at 6 feet and worked alone, and had not needed to think about anyone else's height. Louisa was 5'4". The table was too tall. She used a lower stool from the first week without saying anything about it. On the 14th day, Cal came in from the morning work and found her at the table, and was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the shed and came back with tools, and shortened 2 of the table legs by 3 inches. She did not say he did not need to do that. She did not say it was fine as it was. She put her book down while he worked and watched, and when he was done she put the book back on the table at the new height and said thank you. He said, better. She said, yes, it was better. She thought about the table for days after, not about the table itself, which was now the right height and therefore unremarkable, but about the act of noticing that it was the wrong height and doing something about it without being asked. She thought, he did not tell me the table was fine. He did not tell me I should have said something. He just shortened the legs. She thought, That is what being seen looks like. Not the large occasions. The table. In the weeks at the cabin, Louisa read. Cal had books. Not many, but the specific books of a man who lived alone in the mountains and had needed to teach himself things over 9 years. History, some, navigation charts, a Spanish-English dictionary from the Army years, a surveying manual, a volume on the plants and animals of the New Mexico Territory. She read the plant manual first because it seemed the most immediately useful, and because she had been looking at the mountain plants for 2 weeks without knowing their names. She read the surveying manual second, which was more complex, and which she could not entirely follow without the practical knowledge that went with it, but which she read because her father had surveying implements, and she had always wanted to understand what he did with them, and had never been taught. She said to Cal, one afternoon, "Do you know surveying?" He said, "Some." "Army," she said. "Will you show me?" He got out the instruments from the back shelf and showed her. He showed her the way he showed her the weather reading and the knife throw, practically, with no condescension, as if she had asked a real question that deserved a real answer. She learned fast. She always had learned fast. Her mother had called it her best quality and her most dangerous one. "You learn so quickly," Marie had said, "that sometimes you don't know something until you try to do it without the practice." She thought about that as Cal showed her the surveying instruments. She thought, "I know more things than I've had the opportunity to practice. I have been learning, in my father's house, from books and from watching, without anyone to practice with. This is practice." She thought, "I would like to practice everything." She practiced the surveying. She practiced reading the mountain weather. She practiced the knife. She practiced talking, which was the most important practice, and the one she had been doing least of. On an afternoon in the 3rd week, she said to Cal, "I've been thinking about what I am going to do." He said, "What have you thought?" She said, "I need to earn my own way. I can't live here without contributing." He said, "You contribute." She said, "With the cabin work." He said, "That's not nothing." She said, "It's not enough. I need a skill that has a value in Taos." He said, "What do you have?" She thought about it. She said, "I can read and write and do accounts. I can manage a household. I can cook well. I've been learning the plants." She paused. "I'm learning the surveying." He said, "The surveying?" She said, "Yes." He said, "There's work in Taos for someone who can survey. The land office needs." She said, "I know." She had thought about this. She had read the surveying manual all the way through and had been thinking about it since. "I need more practice with the instruments, and I need to know the legal framework." He said, "I have the Army manual." She said, "I've read it." He looked at her. He said, "When?" She said, "Last week." I read quickly. He said nothing for a moment. Then he got the manual and they went through it together, him filling in what the manual left out from his practical experience, and she asked questions that he said were the right questions, which she took as a reasonable assessment. She thought, "This is what it looks like when your mind is finally being used." She thought, "I have been living below my capacity for 3 years." She thought, "I am not doing that anymore." The knife, the surveying, the weather reading, the plant names, the talking, all of it practice for the life that had been available to her and had not been given to her, because the people around her had other uses for her than the use of her actual capacity. She was going to use her actual capacity. She was going to start here, on this mountain, and she was going to keep using it after. When Tom's Ortega came down from the mountain in May, he carried with him a message from Louisa to the Taos Land Office, inquiring about surveying assistant positions. He delivered it, without comment. The reply came back 2 weeks later. There was work, if she could demonstrate competence with the instruments. Cal spent the month of May teaching her everything he knew about surveying that the manual did not cover. She demonstrated competence in June. She was hired. She was the first woman to work as a surveying assistant in the Taos Land Office, and she was aware of this and did not make anything of it except to do the work carefully and correctly, which she had always done and would continue to do regardless of being first. The Taos Land Office clerk said, "In June, after her first week, you learn fast." She said yes. He said, "Where did you learn the instruments?" She said, "In the mountains." A former Army scout. He said, "He taught you well." She said, "He taught me enough. I did the rest." The clerk looked at her. He said, "Yes, I can see that." He gave her the June survey assignments. She did them correctly. She had always done things correctly when she was allowed to do them. In Taos that summer, she and Cal established the shape of the life they were going to build. It was not entirely a mountain life and not entirely a valley life. Cal came down to Taos with supplies, and Louisa went up to the mountain when the survey work allowed, and they were sometimes in the same place and sometimes in different ones, and this did not trouble either of them, because they were both people who knew how to be alone and had the specific confidence of people who know where the other person is. Louisa thought about this sometimes, about how different it was to be alone in a place while someone you trusted was in a different place, versus being alone without that. She had been alone in her father's house in the second way for 3 years. She had not known the first way until the mountain. She thought, the first way is not lonely. She thought, I did not know that before. She thought, it requires trust. You have to trust that the other person is where they say they are and will be where you expect them to be. And that trust is a thing that has to be built. She had built it. In the cabin, over the weeks, in the specific accumulation of table shortened, knife left on the table, weather lesson given, surveying taught, wrong directions given to her father. Cal had been building it too, in his way, letting her stay, asking only the questions that mattered, not asking the others. She trusted him the way she trusted the mountain weather reading, not because she was told to, but because the evidence was consistent. The evidence had been consistent. In June 1877, in Taos, Tom's Ortega stood at a small altar in the church he attended and served as witness for the marriage of Cal Rader and Louisa Brandt Rader, and then he hosted the wedding meal at his home and fed them the tamales he made that were the best in the Taos Valley. Louisa ate 3 and said, "These are the best tamales I've ever had." Tom said, "I know." She said, "What's in them?" He said, "Family secret." She said, "I could figure it out." He said, "Probably." He gave her a 4th. "Don't." Cal said nothing. He was eating his own tamale and looking at his wife, which was a thing he would do for the rest of his life. Simply look, with the specific attention of a man who found looking sufficient. Louisa ate the 4th tamale. She did not try to figure out the family secret. She filed it under things that are worth keeping mysterious. There were not many of those. She was, by nature, a person who preferred to understand things fully, but some things were better held lightly. The mountain outside the cabin window in the evenings was better held lightly. It was too large to fully understand. You could learn the plants and the weather and the survey lines and the specific way the snow fell in February, and the mountain would remain larger than what you knew of it. She liked that about the mountain. She liked knowing that the thing she lived in was larger than she could fully comprehend. She thought, that is what a life should be, if you are living it right. She thought, I am living it right. She thought, I have been. Since the night I saddled the horse. In September, she returned to the cabin for a week, while Cal brought supplies from Taos, and she worked on the survey maps she was preparing for the land office. She worked at the table, which was the right height, and looked up sometimes at the east window and the mountain going gold in the September light. She thought about the bolt on the door. She thought, I have not thought about the bolt for a while. She thought, that is the right thing. You think about the bolt when you need to know it is there. When you know it is there without thinking about it, you don't need to think about it anymore. She thought, I know it is there. She put her pen to the survey map. The map was correct. The mountain was outside the window. The bolt was on the door, on the inside, hers to draw or lift. She did not need to draw it. She had the choice. That was the whole of it. That was what she had ridden north for. The choice. She always had it now. In the fall of 1877, Louisa was in Taos when she ran into a woman who had known her father. The woman was a rancher's wife, broadly built, with kind eyes, and the frank manner of someone who had decided life was too short for circumspection. She said, "You're Duncan Brandt's daughter." Louisa said yes. The woman said, "I heard what happened." Louisa said, "There are several versions." The woman said, "I heard you left the night before the wedding." Louisa said yes. The woman said, "Good." Louisa looked at her. The woman said, "Elias Cord is not a good man. Everyone in this valley knows it. Nobody has said so in some time because he has money and he owns significant acreage, and saying things about men with money and acreage is complicated." She looked at Louisa. "But you are not required to be polite about it." Louisa said, "No." The woman said, "Your father, he didn't mean to." Louisa said, "I know." The woman said, "He came to the Valley Ladies' Circle and asked if anyone had heard where you'd gone. He looked," she paused. "He looked like a man who had done something he wished he hadn't." Louisa thought about her father. She thought about the 3 years and the ledgers and the way he had described her to Cord, capable, not a beauty. She thought about the specific blindness that comes from grief converted entirely into effort. She said, "He is not a bad man." The woman said, "No, just a man who lost track of what he was managing." Louisa said, "Yes." She thought about that on the walk back from town. She thought about losing track of what you were managing. She had managed, for 3 years, the household and her father's practical life and her own survival, and she had lost track too, had lost track of herself in the management. Had been so busy managing the situation that she had not managed to remain a person inside it. She thought, that is what the ride north was. I lost track of being managed and managed myself instead, for the first time. She thought, I should have done it earlier. She thought, I could not have. I needed the specific night, the specific rain, the specific light through the trees. Some things require the exact moment. She thought about Cal opening the door. She thought about, are you hurt and are you hungry? She thought about 2 of the most specific questions she had ever been asked. She thought, the specific question was what I needed, not are you all right and do you need help and what is going on. Just, are you hurt and are you hungry? The 2 things that mattered in that exact moment. He had seen the 2 things that mattered. He had asked only those. She thought, that is what it is to be seen correctly. She went back to the survey work. The survey work was good. She had grown quickly in it, faster than the land office clerk expected, which she was used to. She had a natural understanding of the relationship between the instruments and the land, the way numbers mapped to physical space, which her father had given her without intending to by being a man who worked with survey instruments, and who she had watched for years without being taught. She thought, I learned surveying from watching my father and not being allowed to practice it. She thought, I practiced it on the mountain. She thought, I practice everything now. She was still practicing the knife throw. She was better at it than she had been in February, but not yet as good as she intended to be. She practiced in the evenings when the survey work was done, behind the cabin when she was on the mountain, or behind the small house in Taos when she was in town. Cal had watched her practice once in September, and had said only, consistent. She had said, what? He had said, you're consistent. The angle is off, but it's the same angle every time. Fix the angle once and you'll have it. She fixed the angle. She had it. She thought, that is the specific kind of teaching, not, you're doing it wrong. But, you're consistent, which means the fix is simple. She thought, I would like to be taught that way about everything. She thought, I have found the person who teaches that way. In December, almost a year after the February night, Louisa and Cal were at the cabin for the winter supply run, and she stood in the doorway after supper and looked at the bolt. Just for a moment. She hadn't thought about it in months. She thought, I don't think about this anymore. She thought, I know it's there. She thought, I know I could open the door or close it. I know I have that choice. I don't think about the choice because I don't need to. It's always available. It's always been available since the first night. She drew the bolt. She turned back to the fire, to Cal at the table with his supply inventory, to the mountain dark outside the west window, and the lamp steady on the table. Home, she had ridden north in February with no plan, and had found this. She thought, it does not always work that way. Riding into the dark in the rain does not always find the light. She thought, but I found it. She thought, I am glad I rode. She thought, I was always going to ride. That is the thing about February 11th, 1877. I was always going to do that eventually. The only variable was how long I would have waited if not that night. She thought, I did not wait very long. She thought, that is one of the things I am most glad of. She sat down at the table with Cal and the supply inventory and thought about the morning they would ride back to Taos, and the survey work waiting, and the things she was learning, and the things she still had to learn. There was so much still to learn. She was glad about that. She was glad there was so much of it, and that she had the time and the space and the right company for the learning. She thought, this is what a life should feel like. She thought, I know now. She picked up the pen and helped Cal with the inventory. The numbers were correct. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Outside, the mountain was very large and very quiet, and it would be there in the morning, exactly as it was, exactly as it had always been, deciding nothing about them except the weather. The bolt was on the door. The door was hers. She did not need to think about it anymore. She thought about it one more time, just to have the thought. Then she let it go. If something in Louisa's story found its way to you today, the bolt on the inside of the door, or the specific mountain light, or the two questions asked in the right order, stay with us. There are more stories here, and every one of them is about someone who rode north when they needed to. In January 1878, Louisa sent her father a letter. She had been thinking about it since the September conversation with the rancher's wife. She had thought, he looked like a man who had done something he wished he hadn't. She wrote to him from the Taos house, the small house she and Cal kept in town when the survey work required it. She wrote in the plain, direct style she was developing, which was the style of a woman who had been practicing saying true things. She said she was well. She was working as a surveying assistant at the land office, which paid fairly and suited her well. She was on the mountain some of the time, and in Dallas some of the time. She had married in June Cal Rader, a former Army scout, a good man who had found her on the mountain in February and had asked only the right questions. She said she did not blame him. She said she understood what the Ledgers had done to him. She had watched it happen, and she had been afraid of it, and she had not known how to say so, and she was saying it now. She said the debt with Cord could be settled another way, and she hoped he had done that. She said she did not need him to reply. The letter was not an invitation to reopen anything. It was simply what it was, a true accounting of where she was and how she had come to be there. She sent the letter. She thought about sending it for some weeks after. She wondered if he had read it. She wondered what his face had done when he read it. She did not need to know. The letter was for herself as much as for him, a way of accounting for the year, of drawing a line under what had happened and saying, here is where I am now, in relation to that. She thought, I am not angry. She thought, I was, in February. And in the months after, I am not now. She thought, that is not forgiveness exactly. It is just, the present got more. The present is more than the February night. The February night is part of the present, but it is not the whole of it. She thought about Meg Farrow, in the blizzard, 800 miles north. Not that she knew Meg Farrow, but she would have understood the sentiment, the present gets more. In time. She thought, the present has gotten more. She thought, I am glad it has. In February 1878, the exact anniversary of the night she rode, Louisa was on the mountain. She had not planned to be there specifically on the anniversary. The survey work had brought her up for a week, and the week had landed across the anniversary without arrangement. She woke on February 11th in the cabin, in the mountain dark before dawn, and thought, a year ago I was saddling the horse. She thought, I did not know, saddling the horse, that I was going to be here in a year. She thought, I knew I was going to be somewhere that was not the homestead in the morning. I did not know what the somewhere would be. She got up and made the fire. Cal was asleep. He could sleep through the fire building, which she had learned in the first weeks and had come to appreciate. She liked the early mornings, the specific quiet of the pre-dawn cabin, the fire starting. She liked being the first sound in the morning. She sat at the table with the first coffee of the year's anniversary and thought about the ride. The rain. The cold. The 2 hours of riding in the wrong direction before she gave up on direction and followed the light. The specific amber square of the cabin window through the trees. The decision to ride toward it. She thought, I made that decision on the basis of a light. I did not know what was in the cabin. I did not know who was in it. She thought, it could have been anything. She thought, it was the right thing. She thought, some decisions are made on the basis of a light. The light is not a guarantee. The light is just the thing you can see that is warm when everything else is cold. She thought, I rode toward the warmth. She thought, I would do it again. She drank her coffee and watched the dawn come up through the east window. The mountain light doing the thing it did in February, a gray-blue light, specific to the elevation, different from any other light she knew. She had learned to love this light. She had not known, a year ago, that she was going to learn to love a light. There was so much she had not known. She thought, that is the thing about making the decision to ride. You don't know what you're riding toward. You know what you're riding away from. She thought, I knew what I was riding away from. She thought, I was right about that. She thought, and I found this. She thought, I am glad I was right, and I am glad I found this. Cal woke when the coffee was ready. He came to the table and poured his cup, and sat across from her in the February morning light. And she looked at him across the table and thought about the door and the bolt and are you hurt and are you hungry and the cabin at midnight in the rain. She said, "A year." He said, "Yes." She said, "I was saddling the horse a year ago." He said, "I know." She said, "You've thought about it." He said, "The door, mostly." She said, "The door." He said, "That you came to the door. That you knocked." She said, "I almost didn't." He said, "I know." She said, "I sat on the horse in the trees looking at the light for a full minute before I rode toward it." He said, "What stopped you from turning back?" She thought about it. She said, "I didn't have a better option." He said, "No." She said, "And the light was warm?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That was enough." He drank his coffee. He said, "I'm glad the light was on." She said, "So am I." She thought about the bolt again, the last time she would think about it with this intensity she understood, because this was the anniversary, and anniversaries were the right time for thinking about the specific things. She thought, "The bolt is on the inside." She thought, "I know." She thought, "I've always known." She put down her cup and picked up the survey map she was working on and went back to the work. The survey map was correct. The mountain was outside the window. The bolt was on the door. She drew it at the end of the day, as she always did, with the specific pleasure of doing a small thing correctly. The cabin was hers. The morning was hers. She was hers. All of it was right. All of it had been right since she rode north on February 11th, 1877, and found the light in the trees. She had just needed to ride. That was all it had taken. She rode. In the spring of 1878, the Taos Valley had a long thaw, and the mountains came down with it. The snow runoff filling the arroyos and the mountain trails muddy until May. Louisa's survey work expanded in the spring, as it always did. More boundary disputes, more land claims. The spring traffic in the Taos Land Office. She was good at the boundary disputes. She had a particular quality of patience with the work that the clerk had mentioned to her, that she could read a boundary question and identify the specific place where the claims overlapped, or where the original survey had been imprecise, and she could explain it to the parties in the plain language of fact rather than opinion, which sometimes made the difference between a resolution and a prolonged argument. She thought, "I learned this from my father, who never taught me." She thought, "I learned to see disputes in land from watching him survey and from understanding, as a girl, that where the line was drawn was the whole of the argument. The line is not opinion, the line is measurement." She thought, "He taught me more than he intended to." She thought, "That is one of the things I will carry forward from him." She did not see her father often. He had replied to her January letter, a brief reply, more practical than personal, saying he was well, and the debt with Cord was settled, and he hoped she was managing. He said nothing about the marriage, and nothing about the specific things she had written about in her letter. He was not, and had never been, a man for the personal in writing. She did not expect him to change. She did not need him to change. She needed to know he was managing, and that the debt was settled, and the letter said both things. That was sufficient. She thought, sufficient. That is the right word. She thought, I have been learning this year what sufficient means, what is enough, and what is exactly enough, and what is more than enough. The cabin was sufficient. The survey work was sufficient. Cal's particular way of looking at her across the table was more than sufficient. She was learning to tell the difference. In May, Tom's came up the mountain with the spring supplies and stayed for supper, and over supper he asked how things were at the land office, and she told him about the spring boundary disputes and the specific one involving the water rights along the South Essequias, which was complicated and interesting. Toms listened to the whole of it and said, "Your father is good with the Acequia questions. He's done that survey before." She said, "I know. He said you could ask him." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I could." She thought about asking her father. She thought about the specific technical question of the Acequia Water Rights Survey, which was a question he could answer in the way of a man who had done the work before. She thought about the February 11th night, and the September conversation with the rancher's wife, and the January letter. She thought, a technical question is a different kind of reaching out. She thought, a technical question is not a reopening. It is just a question. She said, "I'll write to him." She wrote to her father in May, a specific technical letter about the South Essequia survey. He replied in June with specific technical information about the previous survey, including the specific problem with the original markers, which was exactly what she needed. They corresponded, after that, twice more, in the summer, both on technical matters. She did not know if either of them knew what they were doing with these letters. She thought perhaps they were rebuilding the relationship in the only language they both naturally spoke, practical. That was fine. Some things were rebuilt in the language of practical. That was better than not being rebuilt. In June, the day before the anniversary of their wedding, Cal said to her, "What do you want?" She looked at him. She said, "For the anniversary?" He said, "For everything. For the next year." She thought about it. She said, "More survey work. I think I'm ready for the senior boundary cases." He said, "And?" She said, "And to be on the mountain in September when the aspens turn. Because I've been told they're worth seeing and I haven't seen them yet." He said, "And?" She said, "And." She stopped. She thought about what else there was. She thought about the practical correspondence with her father, and the survey maps on the table, and the cabin in the mountains, and the bolt on the door. She thought, what do I want? She thought, I have most of what I want. She thought, that is not something I expected to be able to say. She said, I want to keep doing this. He said, all of it? She said, all of it. He said, good. She thought, that is the right answer. She thought, all of it. She thought, I could not have said that in February of last year. I did not know, in February, that there was an all of it to be had. She thought, I know now. She thought, I am glad to know. She went to the window and looked at the mountain in the early summer light, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, exactly as it had been since before her mother died and her father's ledgers took over, and the 40 acres became a price she was supposed to be. The mountain had been there for all of it, and would be there for all of what came next. She thought, the mountains decide things. She thought, my mother was right. She thought, the mountain decided I should find the light in the trees, and Cal should be in the cabin behind it, and the bolt should be on the inside. She thought, the mountain was right. She turned back to the survey maps. The maps were correct. There was a great deal more to do. She was glad of that. She sat down and began.